I always thought living alone would be peaceful. No noisy neighbors, no interruptions, just me, my thoughts, and the quiet. But quiet is deceiving. Quiet can be dangerous. I had just moved into a small apartment on the third floor of an old building. It wasn't much, cracked walls, uneven floors, and a draft that never seemed to leave. But the rent was cheap, and the view from the living room window overlooked a dimly lit alleyway that felt oddly calming. At least, it did at first. The first night it happened, I didn't think much of it. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling on my phone, the pale glow of the screen illuminating the room. Outside, the street lamp in the alley flickered lazily, casting uneven shadows on the brick walls. The faint sound of cars passing in the distance was the only noise, but something felt off. I couldn't explain it at first, just an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach, like I was being watched. My eyes kept darting to the window, and though I told myself not to look, my curiosity won. At first there was nothing, just the dark alley, the flickering light, and the faint outline of trash bins below. But then as I leaned closer, I saw it. A figure. It was barely visible, standing just out of the light, its shape distorted by the shadows. I couldn't make out a face or any details, just the unmistakable silhouette of someone or something watching. My breath caught in my throat and I quickly pulled the curtain closed. Just a random person, I told myself, someone passing through the alley. But deep down, I knew better. The next night, the unease returned, stronger this time. I tried to distract myself with a movie, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The room felt colder, like an invisible draft was brushing against my skin. I told myself not to look at the window. I told myself it was nothing. But when the flickering streetlight dimmed again, I couldn't help it. I turned my head. This time, it wasn't just a shadow. A face stared back at me through the glass. Its skin was ashen, stretched tightly over angular bones, and its eyes, if you could call them that, were hollow, dark pits that seemed to suck the light out of the room. Its mouth was too wide, stretched into a grin that showed jagged, blackened teeth. It was pressed against the window so close that its breath fogged the glass. I couldn't move. My body refused to respond as its head tilted, the grin widening impossibly. And then it knocked. 3 slow, deliberate taps on the glass. I snapped out of my paralysis, grabbing the nearest thing, a lamp, and flung it at the window. The light shattered on impact, plunging the room into darkness. By the time I fumbled for the light switch and turned it back on, the window was empty. The thing was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, a trick of the light and my overactive imagination. But when night fell, I knew it wasn't over. I sat on the couch again, staring at the closed curtain, waiting. The room felt heavy, suffocating, like the air itself was pressing down on me. And then, just as I started to think I was safe, I heard it. The sound of fingernails scraping against the glass. My heart stopped as I stared at the curtain. The sound grew louder, more frantic, like whatever was out there was trying to claw its way inside. And then it stopped. I held my breath, straining to listen, when suddenly the curtain began to move. Slowly, it lifted, as if an invisible hand was drawing it aside. And there it was. The thing wasn't outside anymore. It stood inside the room, its hollow eyes fixed on me, its mouth twisting into an unnatural shape that wasn't quite a smile. Its body was wrong, too long, too thin, its limbs bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. "Why did you let me in?" it rasped, its voice like nails scraping across stone. I don't remember what happened next. The police found me hours later, huddled in the stairwell, shaking and muttering incoherently. They didn't believe me when I told them what I saw, and when they searched the apartment, it was empty. But I know what I saw. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the knocking. And every time I look at a window, I'm terrified I'll see that face staring back at me, grinning, waiting for me to let it in again. It's strange how silence can feel heavier than noise. That night, the quiet was suffocating, like the world itself had stopped breathing. I was alone in my small apartment on the outskirts of town, a cozy place, surrounded by trees that always seemed to rustle even when there was no wind. I'd moved there for the peace and quiet, but over time, that stillness began to feel unnatural. It was almost midnight when I first heard it, a faint whisper like the softest brush of air, but it wasn't coming from outside. No, it was inside the apartment, and it sounded like it was coming from my bedroom. At first, I thought I was imagining things, maybe the sound of the ceiling fan or the hum of the refrigerator in the next room was playing tricks on my ears. But then it came again, clearer this time, a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, low, deliberate, and dragging out the words as if savoring them. "Come closer." My skin prickled, and I swear the temperature in the room dropped. My first instinct was to turn on every light in the apartment, but something held me back. I don't know why, but I stayed frozen on the couch, gripping my phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the dim room around it, moving in the hallway. Not walking, not crawling, just shifting, like it was sliding along the floor. My breath caught in my throat as the shadow stopped, lingering just at the edge of the living room, where the light from my phone screen barely reached. I wanted to scream, to get up and run, but my body refused to move. My eyes were locked on the thing in the hallway. It didn't have a face, but I could feel it staring at me. The whisper came again, but this time it was louder. "Why are you hiding?" The sound was wrong, like it came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I could barely breathe as I tried to muster the courage to do something, anything. But the shadow began to move again. Slowly, it started to stretch, creeping along the walls like spilled ink. It didn't move naturally. It twisted and writhed as if it had a mind of its own. I couldn't tear my eyes away as it reached the far corner of the room, where my bedroom door was slightly ajar. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. The silence returned, heavier than before, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then, from the bedroom, I heard the sound of the closet door creaking open. Something was in there. I don't know how I found the strength to move, but I grabbed my keys, bolted out of the apartment, and didn't stop running until I was outside. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked in a gas station lot, with the doors locked and the engine running. The next day, I went back to the apartment to pack up my things, but I couldn't bring myself to go into the bedroom. I didn't need to. As I stood in the doorway, I saw the closet door hanging wide open, and on the inside, scratched deep into the wood, were the words, "Welcome back." It was a crisp fall evening, the kind where the air feels sharp and the sky is painted with stars. I was driving home after a late dinner with friends. The road stretched long and empty ahead of me, winding through dense woods on either side. It was the scenic route, the one I usually avoided at night because the trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches clawing at the sky like bony fingers. But that night, I'd convinced myself it was faster. I turned the music down as I drove, preferring the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt. The isolation was oddly comforting at first, but as the minutes passed, the quiet began to press on me. There were no streetlights, no houses, no signs of civilization, just the road, the trees, and the overwhelming sense of being completely alone, until I wasn't. I glanced in the rearview mirror out of habit, and that's when I saw it, a figure sitting in the back seat. I slammed on the brakes so hard that the car skidded, the tires screeching against the road. My heart felt like it had stopped entirely, my chest tightening as I whipped around to look at the back seat. It was empty. I stared for a long moment, my breathing shallow, trying to convince myself that it had been a trick of the shadows or my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. I told myself to keep driving, to just get home and forget about it. But every nerve in my body was on edge. The car felt different, heavier somehow, as if there really was someone or something there with me. As I pressed on, the sense of unease grew. The air in the car felt colder, and I could have sworn I heard faint breathing behind me. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white, and tried to focus on the road. And then the smell hit me. It was faint at first, like damp earth, but it quickly grew stronger. The stench of rot and decay filled the car, making me gag. I rolled down the windows, desperate for fresh air, but it didn't help. It was as if the smell was coming from inside the car. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, and this time I saw movement. A hand. It was pale and thin, with fingers that were too long, curling around the edge of the seat. My stomach dropped, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I wanted to stop the car, to throw open the door and run, but I was paralyzed by fear. The hand was followed by a face, if you could call it that. Hollow, sunken eyes stared back at me, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. It didn't blink. It didn't move. It just stared. I couldn't look away. The car suddenly felt unbearably hot, my vision blurring as panic set in. The thing in the back seat tilted its head, its neck cracking with the motion, and whispered in a voice that seemed to crawl under my skin. "Where are we going?" I screamed. The next thing I remember, I was pulling into my driveway, shaking so badly I could barely hold the keys. I don't know how I got home or how long I sat in the car staring at the empty back seat. I sold the car the next day, but sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I still catch myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that pale face staring back at me. There's something about moving into a new place that feels unsettling, no matter how excited you are. For me, it was a small, affordable rental home on the outskirts of town. It wasn't anything special, just a single-story house with creaky floors and a faint, musty smell. But the price was unbeatable. The landlord said it had been vacant for years, which explained the cobwebs and layers of dust, but I didn't mind. The first few days went smoothly. I spent most of my time unpacking and cleaning, and by the end of the week it started to feel like home. But then, on the 6th night, something strange happened. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a noise, like faint knocking, coming from somewhere inside the house. At first, I thought it was coming from the front door, but when I got up to check, the hallway felt colder than it should have. The knocking continued, steady and rhythmic, but it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the wall at the end of the hallway. I hesitated for a moment, my pulse quickening. That wall didn't lead to another room. It led to the outside of the house, or so I thought. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and something about it made my stomach churn. Against my better judgment, I approached the wall, placing my ear against it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. For a moment, there was silence, and then I heard it. A voice, muffled but clear enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Help me!" I stumbled back, my mind racing. It wasn't possible. There was no room on the other side of that wall, or so I thought. I didn't sleep that night, and by morning I was determined to figure out what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight and a hammer, telling myself I was being ridiculous, but I couldn't ignore what I had heard. When I tapped on the wall, it sounded hollow. My heart sank as I started prying at the drywall. It took hours, but eventually I broke through, and what I found made my blood run cold. There was a room. It was small and dark, with no windows and no door. The walls were lined with rotting wooden planks, and the air inside was damp and suffocating. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the room was a chair, and on that chair sat a figure, its body hunched and covered in cobwebs, its face obscured by shadows. I didn't wait to see more. I stumbled back into the hallway, grabbing my phone to call the police. but when they arrived, the room was gone. The hole I'd made in the wall led to nothing but dirt, as if the room had never existed. I moved out the next day, but I can't stop thinking about that figure in the chair. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear knocking, coming from the walls, no matter where I go. When I first rented the house, I thought I'd stumbled onto a bargain. It was an old Victorian-style home on the outskirts of a quiet New England town, surrounded by a dense forest. The landlord, a pale, wiry man with a nervous smile, was eager to get the lease signed and hand me the keys. "There's only one thing," he said hesitantly as I flipped through the paperwork. "The room at the end of the hall upstairs, just don't go in there." I laughed nervously, thinking it was some strange joke, but his expression didn't change. "Seriously," he added, "lock it, don't open it, don't even think about it." At the time, I chalked it up to eccentricity and figured I'd leave the room alone. I didn't need the extra space, and besides, the house had more than enough charm to make up for one off-limits door. For the first week, everything was fine. The house had its quirks: floorboards that creaked on their own, the faint smell of damp wood, and the occasional chill that made me pull my sweater tighter. But nothing that couldn't be explained away. Until the 7th night. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. A faint whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I strained to listen, I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the end of the hall, from the room I was told not to enter. I sat up, my heart pounding. The whispers were soft at first, almost like the rustling of leaves, but then they grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like voices, multiple voices, speaking in low, hurried tones, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe just the house settling, and tried to go back to sleep. But the next night, the whispers came again, this time louder and more persistent. By the 3rd night, the whispers turned into knocking, 3 sharp, deliberate knocks coming from the other side of that locked door. I told myself to ignore it, to follow the landlord's advice, but curiosity gnawed at me. What could possibly be in that room? Why would someone go out of their way to warn me about it? By the 5th night, I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, I approached the door at the end of the hall. My hands trembled as I slipped the key into the lock, the whispers growing louder with every second. The door opened with a groan, revealing a room shrouded in darkness. The air inside was heavy, cold, and damp, as if the room had been sealed off for decades. The first thing I noticed was the smell: rotting wood, mildew, and something else, something foul and unrecognizable. I shone the flashlight into the room, and that's when I saw them: handprints. Dozens of them, smeared across the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. They were small, childlike, and stained in a deep, reddish-brown color that made my stomach churn. In the center of the room was a single wooden chair, and on it sat a doll. It was old, its fabric body tattered and stained, with buttons for eyes and a sewn-on mouth that seemed to curve into a sinister grin. As I stepped closer, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. And then the doll's head turned. I dropped the flashlight, its beam flickering wildly as it hit the floor. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the room, and before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding me, closing in from every direction. I clawed at the door, screaming, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to move, the handprints pulsating as if they were alive, reaching for me. The doll began to speak. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, its button eyes glinting in the dim light. "You let us out. Now you'll stay." The last thing I remember was the feeling of cold, bony hands grabbing me, pulling me down, and the sound of that guttural laughter echoing in my ears. When I woke up, I was outside the house, lying on the overgrown lawn. The door was locked, and my belongings were scattered around me. I tried to contact the landlord, but his phone was disconnected. When I returned later with the police, the house was gone, just a vacant lot where it had once stood. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, and I know deep down that I didn't escape that room. Not entirely.